Hello and welcome back to the shop, everyone. We have a couple weeks combined into one again. Week 41 was really just one video, so I wrapped it up into here. So we've got week 39, September 26th to October 2nd, and we've got, as I mentioned, week 41, which is October 10th to October 16th. And we're doing more wiring. So we're gonna start by figuring out where I'm gonna place some more of the electrical components onto this panel. Because, yeah, I got a ton to mount in here, so might as well figure out where I want to try and put it all. So you gotta remember, I've got the fuse panel on the ECU on the front side of this, so when I'm putting stuff on the back side, I don't want to be putting, screws directly. Obviously, you can't go directly under something that's already installed, but I also want to be cognizant of where the wires are on the other side. So when I put a bolt or a screw through, it's not rubbing on wires and stuff like that. So that right there is a little terminal strip, and you have one input on the left side and it ties to the output on the right side. They are not all tied together, so each row is tied together, but each row is independent from one another. So what that's going to allow me to do is have my relay module on one side of this plate and run all of the input wires to that relay module onto the right side of that strip, and then all of the triggers to trigger the relays are going to come onto the left side of the strip. So I just marked the center line on the plate, and I'm taking a reference off of the front side as to where my wires are coming up on the front side. So that way I can also make sure that I run the wires in the same place on the back side. Yeah, the reason why I pulled the Dominator off is I knew I was going to be drilling holes, and I didn't want to be drilling through any of the wires going to the ECU, or potentially drilling through the the unit itself. So just pulled it off, made it nice and easy. And I did something stupid. Wasn't wearing safety glasses or a face shield or anything, so while I was drilling the hole, I just kind of looked away. Terrible thing to do. You wear your PPE, don't be like me. Looks like I didn't have it lined up quite the way I wanted, so we're just gonna drill another hole. Well, we're gonna try and drill another hole. looks like I'm having a tough time with this, so let's just see how long it takes me to actually get the hole drilled out. Man, looking back at this, that was terrible. It should not have taken me that long to just drill a hole. But we got there, we got the holes drilled, we got the terminal strip installed, and looks alright so far. Grabbing the vacuum, just cleaning up all the little shards and stuff. I don't want those sitting in the car. I do my best not to, stand or kneel on any of the cables or anything. But it happens sometimes, and I don't want any of those metal shards to dig into the jacket or cut through, because that would not be good. So let's just clean up the mess and continue on. No idea what or why I was writing on there, but I did. So yeah, I mentioned before, those are all of the inputs that are going to go to my switch panel. So that's why I'm just kind of making sure that I've got enough slack to get to the input side of those terminal strips, because the right side is going to be going to the relay module when I get it. Now that I've been sitting here doing nothing for a while, let's start back at doing some work, cutting out all the zip ties that are holding the bungee going to the engine out. What I'm doing is I'm just taking off some of the tape from the original bundle. And I realized one of those wires, that's J1 A10, and I'm thinking to myself, does this really need to go to the front of the car? I don't think it does. So I actually go and I look it up and I look up what it is, and yeah, that wire does not need to go out to the car. Now on the wiring diagram, it comes out of the Holly Dominator and then it splits off and also goes out to the ignition. Well, I didn't need that, and I realized that that wire is just there to turn on the ECU. So all you need to do is put that to your ignition and ignition with crank, and then it'll turn the ECU on. So it doesn't need to go to the engine. I can just have that wired right here in the back to the back panel, no problem. Now that I know that, I can continue unbundling all the wires. And part of the reason why I'm doing this is because the coil trigger wires, because it's, you know, part of coming out of the Dominator, I had it running up with all of the engine wiring. But after looking in the car, I actually want to run it on the other side. And the reason being, I only want wires that are going to the engine connector to run up the passenger side. So that's why I'm undoing the entire engine bundle. You know, that bundle that I spent hours taping up, you know, in a earlier video, I'm undoing that all now. And that's just because I've decided I want to run the wires differently. You know, I probably could have left it, but I didn't like it. I didn't like how the wires ran up the trans tunnel and then would have like jumped across a big gap to get to the dash bar. Whereas if I run them on the other side, it just kind of runs with the wiring that's already there, and it's going to be a lot cleaner. Now that I've got the main bundle untaped, I can now go through and untape the smaller bundle and free up that J1 A10 wire, the ignition and crank wire for the ECU. So I'm just going to spend a bit more time undoing work that I did. You know, I'm not upset about this. This is just learning, right? First car that I wired, and if I didn't have to undo some of the work that I did, I would be quite surprised. You know, I read a bunch of the wiring diagrams and I thought I knew it, but at the end of the day, this is the first one I did, and this is a learning experience for me, so I don't mind undoing some of it and then going through and doing it, you know, what I think is the right way, and doing it best, and, you know, cleaning it up and making it the best that I can. Now that I've got the bundle all separated, I'm going to start rerouting all of the coil trigger wires to the driver's side, just to, you know, start getting them out of the way, and so I can figure out exactly what I need on the engine side. And likewise, I originally had the water pump wires going up on the driver's side here, but since that's going out to the engine, I'm going to run the water pump wires on the passenger side with the ECU wires. So that way, any of the wires that need to go out into the engine bay are on the passenger side, and then any of the wires that are either just routing to inside the car or are going out to the front through the fender firewall connectors, those will be run on the driver's side. Alright, we're just taping the two water pump wires together. Feel like you've seen me do this, you know, 1,000 times by now. No, it hasn't been quite 1,000, but feels like it some days. crank wire. I don't remember why I untape it. It could be because I had some extra wires in there that I don't actually need. I don't fully remember, but I'm untaping them in any case. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the entire bundle out of the car so I can work on it a little bit easier. So one of the other things I had to pull out of this bundle were the coil power wires. As I mentioned before, the coil triggers are now going to run up the driver's side to the dash bar and then out to the fender firewall through panel connectors. So I also need to run the power wires to the coils to the same place. So with those out of the main bundle, I can now retape the main bundle. Hopefully for the last time. got this all sorted out, let's start laying it all back out in the car. gonna do here is there's 3 wires coming off the steering wheel, and I want to figure out which of these buttons is the horn, which of these buttons is the cruise control switches. So I'm just trying to start figuring that stuff out. I'm using my multimeter there, so what I'll do is I'll clip onto one of the wires, and then, you know, for example, I'll hit the horn, I'll hit the cruise control, and, you know, all that stuff, and figure it out. I wasn't getting a really good reading just using the multimeter on the wires. So what I'm doing is I just took the cap off the steering wheel, because the wheel has to spin, so there has to be something that the steering wheel is contacting to transfer the signal to the wires. So that's kind of what I'm doing on the inside, is just looking and seeing exactly how it's working. So I really didn't get the outcome that I was looking for. I wasn't able to pinpoint which wires were which, so figured screw it, just leave it, let's move on, and I will come back to this later. And thinking about this now, if I had half a brain, I would look at the wiring diagram to see which color is which going into there. What I'm doing here is I'm actually removing one of the wires from the fuse panel, and that's going to be the pink wire that I ran, which is hot during crank. Now, the reason why I'm pulling it off the fuse box is because it just doesn't need to be there. None of the circuits on that fuse panel actually need to be alive while I'm cranking. So what I'm going to do is run that onto the back side, onto a terminal strip or a contact somewhere on the back side, and then I'll run jumper J1 A10 to that. And that's 47. He's one of our puppies. So goddamn cute. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually undoing all of the stock taping that came from Holly. I don't need any of it, so I'm just getting rid of it. Oh right, so I'm getting rid of those wires there, that yellow wire and that white wire. So these are kind of a universal harness, so I think one of those is like points out, which I'm not using, and I forget what the other one is, but it's for different ignition type, I think. In any case, I don't need either of them, so I'm just depinning them from the connector, and that's answer. Oh, look at that cute puppy. Yeah, so back to removing pins from the harness. I have a separate input and output harness, so I'm going to use that just to kind of clean up the harness going to the engine and to the body. So I'll just point out all of the ignition, or sorry, all of the input and output wires from that harness, because I'll be using one of the other connectors to actually do that. And now I'm just thinking about stuff and killing time. So as I mentioned, I'm running that hot with crank wire. It's going to be on, you know, the side that you see of the panel. So what I'm doing now is I'm also running another ignition wire. So the fuse panel kit came with one ignition wire, and that's run up into the ignition panel. So when you turn the key to ignition, it powers up all of the ignition circuits on the fuse panel. But what I'm going to do is run a second ignition wire off of the ignition switch, and I'm going to run it to the same place I run the hot with crank wire on this panel, so that way I have an ignition source in two places. One thing that I haven't done yet with all my wiring is make sure that my steering column cover fits over it. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just, you know, taking the two pieces of the steering column cover, and I'm making sure that where I have all the wires run, everything's still going to fit in there and everything will still look nice. As always, just more organization and more cleaning up and more, you know, moving wires slightly and getting to a better area. Okay, now that we are done respooling the orange wire that I use for ignition, I'm going to grab a yellow wire, and the yellow wire is going to be for my line lock. Now what line lock is it's a little device that sits on the front brake line, so you can press the brake pedal, press a switch, and your front brakes essentially stay locked on. So that way it's just easier to spin the rear tires. So if you're at the drag strip, it's easier to do a burnout. And if you're just showing off, it's a lot easier to do a burnout as well. And then when you release the switch, the front brakes release and you can drive like normal. So that wire is going across the dash bar, and that's going to go out the driver's side panel connector. And then I'm just grabbing some other yellow wire for the switches, or for the switch. I really don't know why I ran all three of the line lock wires yellow. I mean, I know one is power feeding up to the switch, one is coming back to the relay panel, and then the third is going to be the relay panel out. But I just don't get why I did them all yellow. It doesn't make sense to me, other than I would know that it's a line lock wire, but usually I'm going to run like orange for ignition or red for battery. So looking back at this, I'm just surprised I did this. Yeah, I don't even know what to say about this other than why. I don't get why I did it, but whatever. My lock wires are taped up, so let's just rough them into the car. One of the wires that up until this point I have left intentionally long is this black wire here, and that's for the O2 sensor. So that's going to go up the passenger side through a grommet in the floor pan, and then it'll tie into the O2 sensor. I left it intentionally long because it's one of those things where if you cut it and you've cut it wrong, there's really no going back. You know, I could potentially get a new one from Holly, but man, it's just possibly an expensive mistake that I didn't want to make. But at the end of the day, I need to do the work, so I cut it. And I'm happy I cut it. So previously I'd cut that bundle down to a rough length, and I think what I'm doing now is I'm getting ready to cut this, you know, essentially to its final length. So I'm just fussing because, again, you know, cutting these bundles is, you know, it can be nerve-wracking because, you know, it's potentially like a, you know, $450 mistake. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with it, so cut all the zip ties and we can pull the bundle out. Before I can pull the bundle out though, what I need to do is I need to remove all of the pins going to the coil trigger wires that are now run up the other side, and that will allow me to actually pull the bundle out. And let's just do a little bit of cleanup so that the bench isn't full of crap. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start going through a couple of boxes and get out the tools that I'm going to need in order to crimp those connectors. So that right there is a special crimper for doing the Deutsch connector pins, the solid terminals. So I'm just going through all the parts and just kind of getting things sorted out and figured out, making sure I got the right pins to use. Just quickly running out to print off a new copy of the wiring diagram. This is a brand new tool for me. I've never used this. So what I'm doing is I'm just figuring out how it all works and figuring out how the crimps work and making sure I don't tighten it down too tight. Otherwise, I would destroy that pin, and that's a perfectly good pin. Yeah, so the way it works is there's that little green knob, and that will adjust up and down, and then there's a little knob above that, and that's just a jam nut. So what you do is you undo that circle nut, and then the green knob will screw in or out and adjust the depth in which the pin sits. So that there's like 3 different sizes of pins, I think. There's one for 18 to 22 gauge, one for 14 to 16 gauge, and one for 12 gauge. So those pins are different sizes. So you need to be able to adjust the depth on the crimper. What I'm doing right now is I'm undoing all of the nuts that are holding on the firewall connector so I can pull it out from the front. Yeah, so I'm just getting ready to terminate all these wires. I'm going to tape them to the bench and kind of get them the way they're going to sit in the car. Because don't forget, in the car it goes, you know, up the passenger side trans tunnel and then up on top of it and then up and then curves left again. So I'm trying to emulate that on the bench here. So I think I've got everything figured out. I think I have enough information that I can actually start terminating this bundle. And just like that, we leave on a cliffhanger. I don't actually terminate anything. That will be in the next video. I'm so sorry to leave you on this note, but that's just the way it goes sometimes. If you stuck around this long, as always, I would like to thank you for viewing, and we'll see you in the next one.